Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Wu. I'm the director of the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you here to this event, the second in our series this fall of the critical issues confronting China. So with that, it's my pleasure to welcome today's speaker, who's Zenobia T, an assistant professor in the Department of Government at Georgetown University. Professor Chan is a researcher in international relations who focuses on economic statecraft as well as influence information operations. She is the author of a book, Alms and Influence, which examines economic inducements such as foreign aid, large-scale investment initiatives, and discounted sales of natural resources, and whether and how that can buy influence abroad. She holds a PhD in politics from Princeton University. She did a fellowship at Oxford before joining the Georgetown faculty. Prior to academia, Professor Chan led an analytics team at Google and has worked for the United Nations, the World Bank, OECD, as well as is an influential commentator in public matters with regards to China's influence operations. Some of you may know her from her recent article in Foreign Affairs, co-authored with David Kang and Jackie Wang, which challenges the viewpoint held by some in Washington that China aspires to replace the U.S. as a dominant superpower. So with that, please join me in welcoming Professor Chan to the Fairbanks Center and for her talk today, The Influence Game, What Does China Really Want?
Thank you for the very kind introduction and for having me here. So today I'm really excited about sharing some of the findings from the book I'm trying to complete. And what motivated today's talk here today is that over the past few years in news articles in different news outlets, we've seen the quote-unquote new Cold War between the US and China. And as a matter of fact, on both sides of the Atlantic, countries have raised concerns about China's potential economic influence or the coercion from China's economic influence. And if we zoom in a little bit and look into the area of development finances, we do see that China is indeed increasingly an important player in this area, particularly given now that the United States is retreating from providing foreign aid to other developing countries in the world. And while a lot of scholars, including a lot of the colleagues here at Harvard, have debunked the talk on China's stack trap diplomacy, it remains a concern that China's development assistance is very different from those from OECD Development Assistance Committee donors, or quote-unquote traditional donors, in that a lot of China's development assistance is given in the form of loans instead of foreign aid. And all these different concerns about China's increasing reach of its economic policy and economic initiatives. In this talk today, and also in my book project and a lot of my research projects, well, I'm looking into the question of what does China really want from its economic initiatives? And today, in particular, I'll focus on the Belt and Road Initiative. And what I hope to convince you and show you some evidence is that the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI, was really initially designed to assuage China's domestic economic and environmental issues, while simultaneously, the Chinese government also hoped to use the BRI to garner international acceptance of China's governance and development models. And here, by acceptance, I really mean very colloquially, letting China do what it wants to do. Because Xi Jinping and many other official documents published by different ministries of the Chinese government, they explicitly reject and object the exporting of China's model. So it's really, like I said, about letting China do what it wants to do. And it leads us to a related question, which is whether China has actually been able to buy influence that it wants to buy through its economic initiatives, such as the BRI. And I also hope to convince you that China has not really been very successful. And the reason is that given all the domestic motivation for a lot of China's investment projects as well as infrastructure projects, once the recipient countries recognizes China's domestic motives for these projects, China, the government, loses leverage over the recipient in extracting more policy concession. And before I move on to share with you more details on the findings, I want to talk a bit about my analytical approach. And to understand China's intentions, which is essentially the analytical exercise that we're trying to do here, we first need to define what intentions are. And here I treat intention as an actor's goals and plans of action. And in international relations, there are a lot of problems associated with the study of intentions, not least because intentions constitute a latent concept that is extremely hard to measure. And scholars have argued that intention is a latent concept and particularly serious as a problem in studying more opaque countries like China or Russia is that we have really limited access to internal information about Chinese politics or very high-level decision-making. And so, amidst these different problems, the approach I take here, which is also the approach I took with my co-authors in one of our recent publications, is we'll treat China's words and deeds as its intentions. And I want to highlight that this is essentially an inductive approach. And it is quite different from, if you're familiar with the international relations literature, it's very different from a lot of the deductive theories of power transition, such as the Thucydides trap. And what we're trying to do here is we will try to understand China's intentions through its words and deeds, rather than making assumptions about its intentions like a lot of the international relations theories would do. And we refrain from doing that is because we think if we make assumptions about actors' intentions, it leaves us super prone to the use of evidence that would be confirming our prior hypothesis. And of course, we didn't invent this approach. And this is actually commonly known as Pekinology, which is the approach that guided the field of China studies during the times of Mao Zedong or pre-reform eras in China. And the idea here really is to use publicly available information to infer the intentions of Beijing or other opaque regimes. I'm sure you might have heard of the term Kremlinology, where scholars use publicly available information to study the Soviet Union. And so while we understand that this is not the perfect approach because, again, we still suffer from the problem of limited information, we still believe that by systematically analyzing official discourse, slogans, and elite appearances, that can reveal meaningful patterns, such as the latest factional dynamics as well as foreign policy priorities. And all this is to say that even under extremely limited information in very tightly controlled systems, what leaders choose to say, what they choose not to say, or they stop saying can offer us valuable clues about their intent. And for what I'm going to present today, we focus on the authoritative official publications of the Chinese government as well as the Chinese Communist Party. And in particular, I looked at People's Daily, which is the official newspaper of the Central Committee of the CCP. I also looked at 求是, which is the leading policy journal of the Chinese Communist Party, where party cadre would read to discern the latest policy directions of the CCP. And I also incorporated data from different official publications of the Chinese government and speeches by Xi Jinping. And to analyze the data, I started with careful reading of these publications in their originals. And to avoid the analytical problem I mentioned, I also conducted a quantitative analysis of the entire corpus. So no cherry picking here. We use all the data from these sources and analyze them as a whole corpus. Now, having talked about my analytical approach, I want to share with you some of the key findings I found from this analysis. So the incentives or the intentions behind the Chinese government's launching of the Belt and Road Initiative can really, we can summarize them into two motivations. The first is to tackle domestic economic and environmental issues. The second one, like I mentioned in the beginning, is really to gain international acceptance of China's development and governance models. Now, the reason why the Chinese Communist Party believe that BRI can tackle China's economic and environmental problems is that prior to the announcement of the Belt and Road Initiative and following the global financial crisis in 2007 and 2008, excess industrial capacity was very serious in several industries in China. And those industries included steel, flat glass, cement, and aluminum productions. And if you think about these industries, they all provide input for infrastructure construction. And the government's idea at the time is that through the BRI, by promoting construction of infrastructure projects abroad, that can increase overseas demand for these output from industries with very serious excess capacity. And reducing excess capacity is important here. For one, excess capacity really limits firms' profitability. And so by solving excess capacity, that can make firms in China more profitable. And making firms more profitable is important because it can prevent mass unemployment. Because if we think about in the context of China, there are many towns which is akin to the Rust Belt in the United States. There are a lot of towns that rely on one or two big steel mill or big factories to provide employment for the entire town. So preventing mass unemployment was really a priority of the Chinese government. And additionally, by increasing firms' profitability, it is also possible for them to accumulate capital for industrial upgrading. And that can help reduce environmental pollution through more modern, higher tech production methods. And in addition to that, by increasing the technological intensity of the economy, that can also help sustain China's economic growth. And all these three goals can help contribute to the prevention of social unrest according to different articles published in 求是 and some in People's Daily. And ultimately, it's about contributing to regime stability, helping the CCP to stay in power. And that's why the Belt and Road Initiative, initially, at least as it was proposed, was a really important project, not least because ultimately it's about contributing to regime stability. And let's look into whether China's words are consistent with what we can see from the data. So here I have the years on the horizontal axis, and on the vertical axis are the capacity utilization of 4 different industries that provide input for infrastructure constructions. And what we can see here is that prior to the announcement of the Belt and Road Initiative, these industries have capacity utilization below or close to 80%. And according to the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, capacity utilization under 80% is classified as very serious excess capacity. So we can see that there was indeed pretty serious excess capacity in these industries. Now, aside from the BRI, the Chinese government has other policies to help reduce excess capacity. So what happens afterwards, I wouldn't attribute all the success in reducing excess capacity to the BRI, but what we can see indeed is that excess capacity was a problem in China, and the Chinese government attributes that as one of the motivations for starting the Belt and Road Initiative. And another question related to China wanting to garner international acceptance of its governance and development model, we can really look into whether it's about exporting the China model. So here is an excerpt from a speech by Xi Jinping at the opening ceremony of the Belt and Road Forum for International Cooperation in 2017, where he explicitly said that China will not interfere in other countries' internal affairs or export its social system or developmental model or impose it on others. Now, for those of you who have been observing China for a long time, we know that this is actually nothing particularly new because it's really consistent with China's 5 principles of peaceful coexistence in terms of not interfering in others' internal affairs. So overall, at least according, based on what the Chinese government, the president, have said, in the words, the BRI is really focused on assuaging domestic, economic, and environmental issues. It does come with another international foreign-facing goal of winning hearts and minds, or at least getting acceptance of its developmental models. But what we haven't seen through these documents and publications is like a goal to be the hegemon or to dominate other countries. Now, I've previously talked about the problem of analytical cherry picking. And so one might argue that what I've just presented, based on my qualitative reading of the documents, might be incomplete, as in the sense that I might have missed something. So the other exercise I've done is I use all the newspapers articles that from the sources I just mentioned, published between 2014 and 2024. So the 10 years following the announcement of the Belt and Road Initiative. So we didn't filter anything else, just all the newspapers that appeared in People's Daily. And to analyze them quantitatively, the first step we did was to use a word-to-vec embedding. And the idea here is to learn about the semantic associations between different words based on their co-occurrence. So to translate this into what exactly we're trying to do here is we use the keywords identified based on the qualitative readings of the documents, so such as excess capacity or environmental issues. We use these seed words, what we call, so excess capacity and environmental issues are the seed words. We use them to identify other words that are associated with the concept of excess capacity, with the concept of environmental issues, or with the concept of the BRI. And having learned these keywords under these different themes, we try to visualize the relationship among these different words using the TSNE algorithm, which is T-distributed stochastic neighbor embedding. So the idea here is that on the next slide, I'll show you the result. And the way to read it, one of the many ways to read it is just the words that appear closer together on the plot, they tend to share more similar contextual meaning. And so here is the plot. I will show you the words associated with different themes I've identified here. So the China model, environment, excess capacity. These are the themes I identified through the qualitative reading of the documents about the intentions of the BRI. Whereas regional economic disparity, winning hearts and minds, these are some other goals that have been identified in the literature about why the Chinese government wants to launch the BRI. And so here, that cluster of words here, over there, the purple words here, these are the words we identified as associated with the Belt and Road Initiative. And on that lower corner, these are the words that are associated with, quote unquote, the China model. And here in the middle, these different clusters of words are different words associated with environmental issues, with excess capacity, with excess foreign exchange reserves, as well as regional economic disparity. And there is an argument in the literature about the intentions behind BRI that it's also about reducing regional economic disparity between the West and the coastal regions of China, such as to reduce the occurrence of terrorism or independence movement, particularly related to Xinjiang and Tibet. So we also found identified words that are related to terrorism, which we can see there is quite far away from the BRI. And there are other words that are associated with winning heart and mind. And one way to read these different clusters of words on the content published in the People's Daily is that we can see that on that corner that is currently with this ellipse, these are the domestic goals of the BRI. And we can see that the cluster of words about the BRI, the purple words up there, are closely associated with these words related to domestic goals. Whereas the international goals on the lower left-hand corner, they're very far away from the mentioning or the discussion of BRI in the official discourse published in the People's Daily. So one way to interpret this is, based on the publicly available published articles of People's Daily, we can see that BRI in this description is as closely associated with domestic goals and much farther away or more distant from international goals, which is consistent with my earlier qualitative reading that the BRI was really driven by domestic motivation. And now, in the remaining 7 minutes I would like to quickly address the question of whether China has achieved what it wants, whether these infrastructure projects really contribute to international acceptance, to China's model. And the theoretic argument I want to propose here is what I label as the inducement dilemma. And the idea here is that one stone cannot kill two birds. Because, as I've hopefully convinced you by now, that BRI infrastructure projects were driven a lot by domestic economic and environmental concerns. Once the recipient countries recognizes these domestic concerns that are motivating China's infrastructure projects, these domestic goals would undercut the Chinese government's bargaining power and undercut its foreign policy goal of influence and buying this acceptance. And to address the question whether these recipient countries really know about China's domestic goal, so based on a lot of interviews I conducted in different parts of Southeast Asia and Africa, a lot of the leaders have discussed that, well, BRI infrastructure projects, they are commercial projects. The Chinese companies involved, the Chinese government also gain from it. So they actually qualitatively have suggested that they have a lot of say in these projects, and the Chinese government cannot really make them do something they wouldn't otherwise do through the use of these projects. And here are some quotes from the Handbook for Publicity of International Cooperation Project, published by the Ministry of Commerce. And it is their policy to, for Chinese government agencies as well as Chinese companies to, whenever they conduct overseas projects, to highlight these mutual benefits and how China is also benefiting from the delivery of these projects. So overall, I would argue that a lot of the recipient countries' governments are aware of China's domestic goal behind these infrastructure projects. And to test these arguments about the inducement dilemma that I just proposed, to answer the question whether Chinese infrastructure project can buy the influence the Chinese government wanted to buy, I created a data set on the volume of Chinese overseas infrastructure contracts. It is sourced from the Ministry of Commerce. It records all the infrastructure project overseas conducted by a Chinese entity that exceeds the monetary value of 100,000 yuan, which is around 20,000 US dollars. So a lot of small scale projects are also included here. And descriptively, what we can see is that since the announcement of the Belt and Road Initiative, the signed infrastructure project contracts totaled about 1.84 trillion US dollars. And since we don't have a very clear definition of the BRI, if we count only those countries that have signed a memorandum of understanding with the Chinese government on the BRI, the total volume of projects with these countries total 631 billion US dollars. And compared to existing data set, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard of on A-Data, this data here from MOFCOM captures many more projects that doesn't fall into the definition of official development assistance. So here we're really thinking about a lot of commercial for-profit infrastructure projects rather than foreign aid. And the outcome variable, how do we measure international acceptance of China's governance model? So here I created a measure of support for China on the human rights situations in Xinjiang and Hong Kong from 2019 to 21. The reason is that these were the only years where Xinjiang and Hong Kong were brought up at the third committee of the UN General Assembly. And I coded a country in a given year as a -1 if they express concerns over the situation in Xinjiang or Hong Kong, 0 if they didn't talk about China or they didn't give a speech at all, and 1 if they call for non-interference in China's internal affairs, and 2 if they commended China's achievement in Xinjiang and Hong Kong. And here are the distribution of the different countries that have said different things about Xinjiang and Hong Kong at the UN General Assembly. And I just want to note that these are not votes, these are just statements. These countries had sent their representative to give at the UN General Assembly Third Committee. And the reason this was chosen as the variable is that I would argue this is a direct measure of international acceptance of China's development and governance model. And in fact, the Chinese government attaches great importance to these statements on Xinjiang and Hong Kong because territorial integrity, particularly related to regions like Xinjiang, Tibet, and Hong Kong, as well as Taiwan, are always considered as China's core interests. And in my interview with the former UN Assistant Secretary General, they highlighted that China really cares about these statements on Xinjiang and Hong Kong because there is always this latent concern that one day these human rights violations might be used as a pretext for responsibility to protect, and China really doesn't want international intervention under the name of R2P. And additionally, the Chinese government, it does actively attempt to influence what other countries say about Xinjiang and Hong Kong at the UN General Assembly. For instance, during the COVID-19 pandemic, the Chinese government threatened halting vaccine exports to Ukraine for Ukraine to make a U-turn on the statement related to Xinjiang. So, and we can also think of these as like really relatively cheap statements for a country to give. So a lot of times these are joint statements signed off by 60 to 80 countries. A country just have to put its name on the statement. It doesn't even have to give it themselves. So, or Chinese officials would also prefer silence on not talking about Xinjiang or Hong Kong. So these are really cheap actions that a country can take. So the idea here is that if China can't change these countries' opinion on relatively low-cost actions such as these statements or such as buying silence, then we shouldn't expect China to be able to exert greater influence on more costly actions. And to really test the inducement dilemma, I proxy net profit with the export of aluminium, cement, iron, and steel from China to the recipient countries. So these are, if you recall from the earlier slide, the industries with the most serious excess capacity. They also provide input for infrastructure construction. So if a country has high imports from China on these products, we should expect this would contribute to solving the excess capacity issue in China. And in this case, China shouldn't be able to buy higher level of acceptance. And so we wouldn't expect any change in support for China when these countries receive more infrastructure projects. Whereas in the case when they receive low imports from aluminium, cement, iron, and steel from China, then China is not benefiting. And in that case, it would more be a quid pro quo situation, and we should expect concession. And so we would see if they receive more infrastructure project contracts, they would support China more. Just to show you quickly the result, up here on the horizontal axis, I have the level of imports of aluminium, cement, iron, and steel from China. And the vertical axis is the estimated average marginal coefficient on the effect of receiving more infrastructure projects on their support for China at the UN General Assembly. If the inducement dilemma is correct, we should expect null effect here. So the coefficient should be statistically insignificant here, crossing zero. Whereas if quid pro quo is happening, we should expect positive coefficient on that side of the plot, which is what I found, which is consistent with both of the hypotheses. And just to conclude, so hopefully I've convinced you that behind the Belt and Road Initiative, the Chinese government has two key sets of goals. One is to tackle domestic, economic, and environmental problems. The other is to gain international acceptance of China's development and governance models. And based on the argument on the inducement dilemma, these two goals are actually in conflict with each other in the sense that the domestic goal of resolving excess capacity, solving economic and environmental issues, undercut the foreign policy goal of buying acceptance. And this is something we can also see looking further ahead. In 2021, when Xi Jinping first proposed the idea of high-quality Belt and Road Initiative. And I think this is really closely related to the learning on the Chinese government's side understanding that the BRI might not be able to help them achieve the international or the foreign policy goal they would like to achieve. It would be wise for them to switch to what they call a higher quality BRI, where they put in more vetting in when they make a loan and more better governance of the infrastructure projects they are engaging in. Because in that sense, having more risk assessment and providing high quality projects that can serve the domestic goal better, understanding that it might not be able to exert foreign policy influence through these infrastructure projects. And with that, I look forward to any comments, questions, and suggestions you might have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Chan. I'm going to start off the Q&A session just with a couple of quick questions for you, and then we'll open up to the audience. One of the things that's very interesting about this talk compared to some of your other articles and writings is this presentation in some ways very much echoes or reflects sort of the conventional viewpoint held in much of the major Western capitals who China would view as its geopolitical rivals, right? So this is similar to what you hear in Washington or in Brussels or even in Tokyo. The BRI is not really designed to help you for developmental purposes, or it's not really designed to help to push back against neo-colonial type projects that have sort of all these type of circumstances and so forth. This presentation kind of validates the messaging that's coming out from the West, that the BRI is a selfish initiative designed to serve China's own domestic interests. So given this type of narrative is becoming more and more popular inside academia, mainstream, and so forth, and it's even making its way through to the global South, given that this talk series is about critical issues confronting China, what do you think China's foreign policy establishment should do in terms of much of your other work talks on China's influence operations and the importance of controlling the narrative and so on and so forth. So I think the critical issue confronting China is there's been two competing discourses, and the research like yours actually validates that the West's discourse is the correct one. So what do you think China's response ought to be in terms of its influence game? If the academic research kind of confirms what the West is saying, but China wants to continue to gain influence with many of the rest of the G77?
That's a really good question, and I wish I have a very good answer for the policymakers, which I don't, unfortunately. But I think the way I look at it is that for most government, domestic priorities are always the top priorities, and I don't think the Chinese government is any exception in that regard. And in fact, in the international security article with Dave Count and Jackie Wong, we found that whenever the Chinese government talk about the word struggles, which refers to, in the Marxist sense, when the Chinese and China as a country is facing the most substantial challenges, most of them, over half of them in most years, are about the economy. And so I think we shouldn't be too surprised that the Chinese government policy, including foreign economic policy, is about tackling domestic economic challenges first. And the other thing I would say in terms of influence, so what I've just tested is the stated international or foreign policy goal of the Chinese government. But it doesn't mean that BRI or infrastructure projects or China's development assistance do not have other kind of collateral or unintended effects on the recipient countries. I mean, in international political economy, a lot of researchers have shown that, in some places, if these projects are well implemented, they can actually improve China's image with the locals. So that fits into more the winning hearts and minds narrative. So I think maybe perhaps focusing on developing high quality projects that can benefit both Chinese companies, Chinese contractors, as well as the local recipient and local economy would be one way to go.
And I'll ask one other follow-up question, and I want to expand the conversation a little bit more to some of your other work, right? So I think some of your most interesting work has been looking at China's influence operations, particularly alongside Russia's, and then also your argument that you put out that China doesn't have sort of these grand geopolitical goals, but China does have very concrete goals with regards to the Taiwan issue. And certainly on the Taiwan issue, we have seen under this present government a real shift in both the actions as well as the words, which has caused many capitals to shift China's views as to what China's intentions might be. I wanted to ask the question almost, to what extent is really that the key issue, and this is just a peripheral issue? In other words, if there is a change in status quo in the Taiwan Straits at any point in, say, the next quarter century, that will mark a real shift in the international order. And so to what extent is this all sort of peripheral, and right, the real influence game is really about what one can do or not do in terms of acquiring influence about what one's actions might be in the event of some type of shift of that sort?
I think so. As a lot of you may already know, Taiwan reunification has always been a priority of the Chinese government and the Chinese Communist Party, and it would really focus on the rhetoric about what Chinese official medias, including about People's Daily, as well as what Xi Jinping has said. In one of the related projects with, again, Jackie Wang and Noel Foster at the Naval War College, what we found is that Xi Jinping, during his time as the president of China, he has never ever issued a threat towards Taiwan. And whenever he talks about Taiwan, whenever he talks about Taiwan, it's always about cooperation. It's always about refraining from independence. So I still do believe that from the Chinese government's perspective.
Let me elaborate. I think what I meant from the rhetorical standpoint, certainly I think that's true, right? But I think in terms of the statements, this is not an issue to be passed on from generation to generation. There's been a change in terms of the time frame of having that issue solved. And then certainly from an action standpoint, if you look at the military buildup, and if you look at the flyovers and the influence operations and the cyber operations from the action standpoint. So I would argue that there is a shift on both the rhetoric and the, not maybe at the 30,000 foot level, but certainly at the tangible level, and certainly from the action standpoint. And I think the question I just want to ask is, I think in some ways, some are saying, that is the key part here, and all of this with what's going on with BRI or China Development Bank loans and so on and so forth. That's all peripheral, or those are all small steps in view towards sort of this larger showdown to come that's going to take place in the region. I wanted to ask, sort of tying these different parts of your work together, how would you respond, or what do you think of that type of argument? Do you think this is really two separate parts? Two separate parts, two separate operations. These are really coordinated. Even if one takes your argument, that there is no larger plan, to acquire greater influence or to displace U.S. hegemonic, sort of intentions. Even just a shift in the strait itself would mark such a change in the international order. So I just wanted to ask on that question there.
Right. Thanks for clarifying.
Yeah.
So I think it's important when we analyze China's intention to not see Taiwan as an international or foreign policy issue, because to the People's Republic of China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Xinjiang, Tibet, these are all internal issues. So if we're thinking about China's international goal, about the argument that China doesn't want to be the hegemon, I think we should separate Taiwan and Xinjiang and Tibet and Hong Kong away from this issue. Now, to the question about whether there is a shift on Chinese views towards Taiwan, I would argue that a lot of what we see in the data, at least measured in terms of intrusion of Taiwan's ADIZ, Air Defense Identification Zone, a lot of it is reactionary to such a statement made by the Chinese government on independence or other purchase of arms from the United States. Usually this kind of ADIZ intrusion from the PLA is a reaction to something that happened in Taiwan. And we saw much less of these events before under the KMT, because the KMT talks much less about independence. Its stance on these issues are very different from different DPP leaders in Taiwan.
All right, so I'll open it up to the audience. If you have a question, please raise your hand. Please wait for the microphone and please identify yourself. Please keep your question to the form of a question. Thank you.
Are we okay with recording this part of the event?
Yeah.
Okay. We just wanted to check.
Okay, thank you. It's a very interesting study, and I have a specific question to the empirical test of the BRI achievements part. So I think there may be an endogeneity or reverse causality.
Can you identify yourself? I'm sorry.
Identify myself?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm a visiting PhD student at Harvard Kennedy School, and I have a specific question to the empirical test of the BRI achievements part. I think there may be an endogeneity or reverse causality problem. Countries that expresses negative concerns over China's human rights issues tend to have poor diplomatic relations with China. That will make them less likely to accept China's BRI project. So the volume of the BRI contracts will naturally be smaller in these countries. If there's a problem, I guess. Okay, thank you.
That's a completely valid concern, but I didn't see that in the data. In fact, some of the largest recipients of Chinese infrastructure contracts are the United Kingdom, the United States, and Canada.
Hi, I'm Nishant. I'm a doctoral scholar from India and a visiting fellow at Harvard Yenching Institute. Wonderful presentation, and it kind of gives us insights into what many have been thinking and validates it. But what I was thinking is about the measurement of what the intentions are through Renmin-Ribao and also through Chusha. So I've been working around corpus methods in my own research, and when I was looking at policy instruments used around patriotic education in China, what I discovered is that the problematizations that the policy tries to create, and I was measuring it using negative words and prohibitives and such. What I discovered is that in different policy instruments, the gradation of problematization is different. It depends on the topic clusters as well as the object of the policy. So, keeping this in mind, do you think Renmin-Ribao and Chusha would be the ideal corpus sets to identify the intentions? Because from my research, what I see is that the problematizations varies based on the document type. So there must be different programmatic documents, opinions, measures, guiding principles, notices, and some other policy instruments that are used in China in different fields. So is it possible to also look at those to kind of identify the intentions and gauge it a little more comprehensively?
Thank you for that great question. So in terms of whether People's Daily and Chusha are the ideal corpus, I think they are good for the fact that they are authoritative. So what they publish represents the views of for People's Daily case, it represents the Central Committee of the CCP. And in the bigger project, I've actually repeated the analysis with 20 other different newspapers at different level of authoritativeness. Some are more tabloids like Global Times, but a lot of what we find is still very consistent with what we found in the People's Daily corpus. And when it comes to other policy documents, usually the policy documents talk a lot about implementation, but less about explaining the motivation, but I can definitely look into that, so thank you for that suggestion.
Good afternoon, I'm Thomas Ng from the Harvard Advanced Leadership Initiative. Thank you for the presentation. One of the charts you had on your slides show a lot of data on deal volumes and so on, and up till 2020. It would be really interesting to see if you have any data post 2020, especially after COVID. I think there's a lot of anecdotal evidence suggesting non-defaults, and that's probably the best way to measure the success or the lack thereof of BRI projects. And it'd be really interesting to see if deal volumes have decreased as non-defaults increased anecdotally, and it'd be good to see some empirical evidence.
Yeah, so I do have the data up to 2022. So yes, we do see a decrease in the volume of newly signed infrastructure project contracts. And I would think that this relates to the fact that in 2021, around April, the Chinese government ordered this stock-taking exercise among the policy banks and the major commercial banks in China in terms of what kind of sovereign loan or major infrastructure loans they have given to other countries. So for a period of time that was close to a year, there were no new loans that were made. And I think to your point about loan default, it has partly to do with the fact that until very recently, most of these Chinese banks didn't have a risk assessment team in the banks. They just, I remember talking to some of these loan managers. They are people who are educated usually in Washington, D.C. at SAIS or Georgetown, and then they have some training in international economic policy. But they were not exactly bankers who would model the risk like normally when a loan manager would do. So I think that partly contributed to the risk of loan default and a lot of these infrastructure loans. But I think that goes back to the point why Xi Jinping later proposed this high quality BRI, where they really wanted to focus on smaller projects, what they call small but beautiful, and also focus on projects that are of lower risk.
Hi, I'm Dinda Elliott, the Executive Director of the Fairbanks Center. And thank you, firstly, so much for the interesting talk. I wanted to, so at the risk of sounding like I'm sort of conspiracy obsessed, I wanted to ask you about the fact that you're taking, taking 就是, these publications at face value. Because since you're looking at influence and influence games, if that's sort of talking about United Front and Tongjian, this kind of stuff, isn't that generally sort of, not discussed publicly, and there would be motives that are not out there in the public that have to do with, China trying to gain influence in a more political sense in the world?
That's a really good question. And again, like I mentioned when I discussed the analytical approach, it is not a perfect approach. But the way I look at this is in the benefit of hindsight. If the BRI was really about buying influence, I don't think we would see it shifting towards to high quality BRI after Zambia's potential loan default. And I think because if China really just wanted to use these infrastructure projects to buy influence, it could really provide loan forgiveness or other benefits to the recipient country in order to really influence their policy. But this is not what we are seeing, because the Chinese government has this aversion to any loan forgiveness. They can, extend grace period or give loan holidays, but I don't think they would really forgive it. And I think it has to do with the fact that a lot of these projects are really there to serve domestic economic interests, and a lot of Chinese banks could not afford to have those loans defaulted.
I am Shinjuku here. I'm an executive director of the Program External Relations at the Georgetown Center. I read your security article before coming here, and it's fantastic. So highly recommend it. My question is, the outcome variable that you're measuring is support for Chinese human rights situations in Xinjiang and Hong Kong. And I think we tend to think of diplomatic influence. So my question is, do you have other kind of outcome variables that you've thought of? So for example, a country's position on Taiwan, or we also kind of tend to think of influence as more, let's say, developing closer diplomatic or military relations, arms trade. So I could see the presentation, the variable you chose as very significant, but I'm just wondering if how we should conceptualize that in the context of a very specific outcome variable that you chose.
Thank you for that great question. I totally through the last maybe 5-6 years studying this topic, I thought about other ways to measure influence, but unfortunately I have not come up with a measure that is simultaneously have a global coverage and we have confidence that the data is not missing at random. We can think about arms trade between China and other countries, but the data there is a lot of missingness, and we don't know whether it is actually a zero or we just don't know. And in terms of a position of Taiwan, this is purely a statistical modeling issue. There are only around 11 countries that still recognize Taiwan, and there is not enough variation to attribute that variation to just BRI projects. But this is a question that I keep thinking, and if I have an update, I'll let you know.
Hi, Eva from Asia Center. I have a question. Let's see, just kind of think the other way. I personally, initially, I think the BRI is really a great idea. It's just like a modern Silk Road. How about if the PRC system is more democratic and also more freedom for speech? The whole system changed, and also no human rights issue. Do you think that BRI could, succeed internationally? Not under this kind of a system right now, because the way we see it, the criticism is more like to do with the China's system. So, what do you think? Under different, the political system, as a BRI will be more successful. Thank you.
I think to answer this, first of all, thank you for this question. I think to really answer this, we will need to understand what the goal would be in a different China, and short of knowing that goal or the new goals of a different China, it would be very hard to answer that question. So I don't have an answer, unfortunately.
Thank you, Professor Chen. My name is Yuxing Zhang. I'm this year's M1 postdoctoral fellow at the Fairbank Center. I have a question regarding the role of local bureaus in terms of their participation in the BRI projects. Because since China has a centralized state with local bureaus or local governments, who still have some, who still retain some sort of flexibility in terms of their innovation and developmental, agendas and policies, as well as how to really present, the materialization of some of the environmental efforts. So since many of the research on BRIs, they tend to present, China as a homogenized whole. But I'm wondering, does your research reveal the role of the local bureaus? Do they compete for their participation in the BRI project? Or how do the local bureaus work with the central government, to boost their own local economic situations and their futures? Thank you.
Thank you for the great question. So in my own work, I focus less on what happens domestically in China, but I think you can reference Professor Yan's work on the domestic politics of BRI and other development initiatives in China.
Hi, Professor Chen. Thank you for this very interesting and thought-provoking presentation. I'm Yi Jun. I'm affiliated with Harvard Yanjing Institution, visiting student. And my question is about how can we understand your funding from a more comparative perspective. As you mentioned that it's common for countries to reinforce foreign policies all those aid projects based on like one country's domestic goal. So how China is doing things differently from other countries?
That's a really difficult question to answer because I think in a very high level, I would believe that a lot of countries, and focusing on international relations theories, we would talk about the realist assumption of countries are all maximizing their own interests. And I would say potentially China, compared to many other countries such as the United States, it has a different political institutions and different decision-making system, which I would believe have downstream consequences on how what the goals are for different foreign policy. But to really address the specific of your questions, I think it will need a very nuanced answer, because I believe a different issue area, the answer will be very different.
If I may jump in here, I think Professor Chan's research here is quite instructive, right? Because if you think about other countries that face the domestic economic downturn, where all of a sudden there's overcapacity and excess surplus, they would choose to bite the political bullet and then choose to close down many of those factories at much greater political costs, given that they actually face elections, right? So in that one sense, right, the first of the two variables that Professor Chen is highlighting, that's quite different than what you've seen of other European, Japanese, or American aid packages, all of which have faced the same, right? If you look at that list of industries, they've all faced downturns in steel, aluminum, right, glass, and so forth, yet they haven't done an excess program of that sort. The second part is on the environmental side, right? Certainly, here China has some very ambitious environmental goals in line with its Paris Agreement pledges and so forth. Again, other countries have had those goals, but you don't see those countries putting in a massive aid program to the extent China has, to try to balance the ability to have those goals met at home, but yet still be producing, right, sort of the brown equivalents, but just deploying those overseas. So I think both of those are quite different if you think about the fact that, you know, other countries have also faced economic downturns, and in each of these sectors, and other countries have ambitious Paris Agreement climate goals that they're striving to meet, yet they're not sort of pushing this out in any program. So I don't know if I'm answering the question for you, but I'd say actually your research is highlighting some really unique elements of China's foreign-facing development programs.
Thank you, Professor Chen. I am a PhD student here at the Department of Government, and I have a question big time about going back to some of your motivations as well as some of the implications of the study. First of all, I wasn't very convinced by your motivation or your explanation on using high-quality BRI as an indicator that this is state intention. So I was hoping you could clarify more on that, which I'm going off of the fact that strategic actors have an incentive to lie and hide information. And I am not certain whether high-quality BRI would be a good indicator of actual intent. I believe there might be more things to consider here, so but I would be very much be thankful if I could hear more on that. And also, as to the implications of your study, I was wondering whether actions with domestic focus, so like this is harking back to your other publications recently, whether what China doesn't want or China does want. I was wondering whether actions with domestic focus can have externalities that which the U.S. will nonetheless perceive as a threat. For example, you could maybe dub it as an economic security dilemma, where floating Chinese steel producers has undercut U.S. producers, leading to a very protracted exchange of tariffs since the first administration of Trump. And even if we may view China as a naval buildup as a way to spend more steel in order to float its industry, this is a classic example of where you increase a state's security, economic or military, has led to an undercutting or a loss of security of the U.S. And I was wondering what your research might speak to that as well. Thank you.
That's a really, really good set of questions. So the way I think about it is, aside from the words, we need to look at the deeds. And I think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think we have very clear evidence of China actually trying to influence the politics of the recipient countries of the BRI. One can argue that a lot of Chinese companies doing these infrastructure projects, they might not be held to the highest environmental, safety, or labor standards. But if we compare to other multinational corporations operating in the same regions, a lot of them have similar issues. So I think to really make the argument that China is strategically misrepresenting its incentives, we need to compare what China's actions, whether it is more consistent with its words or whether it is contradictory to its words. And I think as of now, the evidence I'm seeing is more consistent, sometimes with deviations. then but I don't think that deviations is systematic away from influence. And on your point about the negative externalities, I think you're just highlighting this super important concept of security dilemma. And I think other than more communication and, just because when we're talking about it's a distributed problem in terms of international trade that inherently will produce losers and winners within the same economy. And I think to assuage those issues, tariffs is potentially one policy remedy, but there are other ways countries can do and have done to solve that redistributive problem, because a lot of economists would still argue that at the economy level, international trade, free trade is beneficial. And I think right now the problem we're facing is more within these economies. How do we redistribute the benefit from international trade to compensate the losers from international trade?
Hi, Professor Chen. Thanks so much for this amazing presentation. I'm Katniss, a doctoral student from the law school. I have a method question, if I may. So you have this nice chart about the China's logic about reducing the industrial capacity, big firms in China more profitable, and then I'm running a course. So I wonder, are you making a causal argument here, or like more correlated? And I wonder how you make this logical chart based on the massive data. Because like eventually, like the pieces like you assess in people's study or Choushi, they do not link this logic line so clearly. So I wonder how you do this, and that I want to see like how that really matches the reality of what China intended at like what it says that they wanted to do. Thank you.
Great. So that flow chart is the one where we talk about the three goals. Actually, I would just say it's my graphical summary of my understanding of the articles I read. The logic is explicitly stated in a lot of these Choushi articles related to BRI and how it can help China's domestic economy. So it's really just, if you're thinking like a student, is my study note of Choushi.
Thank you, Professor Chen. My name is Michael Susanto. I'm a Harvard alum, and until recently I spent about 30 years working in China. My question is, following the post-COVID era where the Chinese economy downturn actually, in my view, has gotten worse, do you research on how the BRI activities actually, are they continuing, are they slowing down? Are the state-owned companies that used to be involved in BRI, are they more focused to fixing problems at home? Or do they actually see expansion overseas actually a way to remedy their profitability?
That's a great question, and I believe there will be a lot of heterogeneity across different state-owned enterprises. But in terms of infrastructure project contracts, we do see a little dip in the overall total volume of newly signed contracts. And I think from my interviews during the research for these different projects presented today, I think one of the things I've learned is a lot of Chinese state-owned enterprises, they really want to expand overseas, particularly in economies like the United States, European Union countries, as well as the United Kingdom or Canada, so advanced industrialized economies. But the problem they often face is they are not competitive enough to compete in these markets with their local competitors. So I think with all the economic stagnation that's going on in China, the Chinese government have announced different policies measures to encourage like Chinese companies to going abroad or export more. And I guess it is an empirical question that we'll need to see.
Hi, Professor Chen. My name is Max. I'm a PhD student here in education school. Thank you for the presentation. My question is, let's say your theory is the right theory, that it's mostly a domestic-facing agenda. Then my question is, what do you think leads to the pushback in many international discourse on BRI? Is it a genuinely communication issue that China should state its intents
better, or is it more like a big power conflict or ideological clash? It doesn't matter how China say it. If it's initially coming from China, it's not going to be well received.
Again, I think this goes back to the idea of security dilemma. What one state does that serves as defensive objectives can be seen as offensive to the other state. And I think a lot of research in political psychology has suggested that in very high-stake issues like international cooperation and national security that we are talking about here, leaders tend to think about the worst and assume the worst if it's coming from a country that is not extremely friendly or a close ally. So I think communication will be one way, and I think more transparency on both sides will help. I wish I had a solution to that problem. I think it's a long-standing issue in international politics.
Thank you so much. My name is Kathy Huang. I'm a Master in Public Policy Student at HES. My question is, I wonder if you can talk about this in the context of the newly announced Global Governance Initiative by Xi Jinping, and also just in general the 4Gs. And you mentioned about how China's goal is not to be a hegemon in the international order, but what is China's goal exactly?
I would argue that, let me answer the questions backward. I would argue that China's goal is really to tackle its domestic economic challenges. And on your question about 4G, you mean the telecommunication system or?
I meant like the global governance initiative and the other global initiative that Xi Jinping announced.
Yeah, that one I have not dig deep into the details to give you an educated answer.
This will be our last question.
Thank you, Professor Chen. Matthew Yeo, I'm also a fellow in the Advanced Leadership Initiative. Stepping back from the BRI issue specifically, taking a broader view, and referring to your paper in international security, wondering if you can give us some, because you're based in Washington, presumably you live in Washington, you hear what goes on in Washington. My sense is that paper generated a lot of controversy because it pushed against the Beltway consensus that China is in fact seeking to establish itself as the global hegemon, to supplant the United States in that respect. Just could you give us a flavor of what that has felt like in Washington to be pushing against the bipartisan consensus, one of the few areas of bipartisan consensus in Washington today? Just interested in that almost from a personal perspective.
Thank you, great question. So one thing I find very interesting after the international security paper was published is that the public comment on the paper tend to be very negative, and the private emails we received tend to be very positive. And in private conversations with a lot of observers of Chinese politics, people were like, yeah, actually, we know this is what happened, but we're glad that someone managed to say it. And I would say my short time in DC, about a bit more than a year, that my 2 cents is that a lot of people would have incentives for a political appointment in the future, and so people are very measured in terms of what they say in public, and I think that contributes to partly why some consensus are not challenged more.
So I hope you all will join me in thanking Professor Chen for all of our work.